states need to go after him right away. Because the only way the states could go after him, though, is if he did that within the purview of his office as a federal official. As a federal official, they can't touch him unless he went beyond the scope of his office, what it permitted, and in that case, they could. So it looks to me like he knows they can get him on going beyond the bounds, and the states can come after him. Looks like he's in a lot of trouble either way, I hope. I doubt it. Who's that? We're talking about Dr. Fauci, the mass murderer.
Well, I guess
You gotta do your invitation on one time.
I guess fortunately we don't have crazy people on the right who will, just go and take out somebody and take the law into their own hands. I'm glad that we don't have someone out there doing that. So let's continue on. This is the testimony of the evangelists. This is the second part. It's a two-part lesson, and this isn't the whole book. This is actually just the I don't know if is the audio going. Maybe you could tell me. I can't tell. Sorry, there's a lot of moving parts going on. Hello, testing. You see the VU meter? Yeah. Is it moving?
Yeah, it's moving.
Okay, sorry. If you were listening, the one or two that might be. All right, so this is the second part of this two-part lesson, and this was written in 1846. So this is quite a while ago. I mean, not quite 200 years. 180, would that be? Or 2026. So it'd be 1946, 2046 minus 20. That right? My math right? So 1946 would be 100 years, right? So 2046 would be 200 years minus the 20 to get back to 26, 180. Is that right? Okay. I'm sorry. The math, I say my math is mathing the way it should. Not that matters, but I mean almost 200 years. So we studied last time. We'll do a little recap. So last week we saw a Greenleaf starting point. Historical facts are proved by moral evidence, not mathematical certainty. And the Gospels meet the ordinary legal test for genuine ancient documents. We also saw that skeptics often quietly reverse the burden of proof. He was very pointed about this. The skeptics of his day holding or demanding more of the Gospels than any other ancient text. They would not do that with anything other than the Gospels, but they, for some reason, demand more. Now, if you were in a court of law, maybe that wouldn't matter so much. Maybe you say, well, they all need to be treated equally. However, in the court of spirituality and whether or not we should follow after an ancient document, of course, we wouldn't, take, just any old ancient document, whether it's legitimate or not, and follow after it. We demand more proof. But in terms of, whether they are real, whether they are not, forgeries, not, made up, in a legal setting, there are certain criteria. And then finally, we met the four witnesses, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and their specific qualifications to observe and report accurately. So in this lesson, we're going to put them on the stand where they can't take the fifth. But speaking of fifths, there's a 5-part test. Greenleaf quotes a legal authority of his day for the standard test of any witness's credibility, then applies each part to the evangelists in turn. So here's a quote from this essay. The credit due to the testimony of witnesses depends upon, firstly, their honesty, secondly, their ability, thirdly, their number and the consistency of their testimony, Fourthly, the conformity of their testimony with experience. And fifthly, the coincidence of their testimony with collateral circumstances. So honesty, ability, the number, and the consistency, the conformity, and the coincidence of their testimony with collateral circumstances. Greenleaf's argument here is one of the most quoted in all of Christian apologetics. The apostles gained nothing in this world by their testimony. No money, no status, no comfort. And they lost everything: reputation, safety, and in most cases, their lives. A person might tell one comfortable lie under pressure, but Greenleaf's point is that people do not knowingly maintain a lie without a single one of them breaking ranks through decades of poverty, imprisonment, and execution with absolutely nothing to gain by it. And this is, of course, an argument we've made many times before. Just interesting to see it in this document, so old. Greenleaf sharpens this into a genuine dilemma. Suppose the apostles were good men. Good men do not persist for years in deliberate, solemn falsehood, invoking God's name with no temptation and against every one of their own interests. Suppose instead they were bad men. Then the theory collapses even faster, because bad men don't invent religions based on self-denial, honesty, and the renunciation of exactly the vices that would define a bad man, right? So it's antithetical. So here's another quote. It's incredible that bad men should invent falsehoods to promote the religion of the God of truth. The supposition is suicidal. He also notes the character revealed in their writing itself. Men acting under an abiding sense of the presence and omniscience of God do not read like men constructing an elaborate hoax. Either way, good men or bad, the theory that they simply invented the story does not survive contact with what we actually know about human motive. So from both sides, it can be falsified. So that's test one. Test two, ability. This connects directly to what we covered last week. The ability to testify accurately depends on opportunity to observe and habits of careful attention. Matthew's tax collecting career trained him in exactly this kind of scrutiny. Luke's medical training shows up in small, precise clinical details other writers pass over. He alone specifies which hand was withered and alone reports the medically specific detail of Jesus sweating, as it were, great drops of blood under extreme agony. Greenleaf also points out that the burden of proof runs the same direction here as it did with the documents themselves. Courts presume ordinary witnesses to be of sound mind and average intelligence unless the opposing side actually demonstrates otherwise. Another quote, "No lawyer is permitted to argue in disparagement of the intelligence or integrity of a witness against whom the case itself afforded no particle of testimony." Now that's probably in a court of law. Now, if you were up in front of, Congress, I think they can just say whatever they want to, right? But in an actual, blindfold, scales of justice trial, you have to assume that a witness, unless it's pointed out, unless there is evidence to the contrary. In other words, simply asserting that ancient unlearned men couldn't possibly have observed and reported accuracy is not on its own an argument. It has to be backed by actual evidence of incompetence, which Greenleaf argues the critics never supply. I mean, is there any argument? Are you aware of any argumentation that these men were?
The closest I can think of would be the allegation that they were inconsistent even within their own narratives and between the different narratives about, say, the details of the crucifixion and resurrection, for example.
Mm-hmm.
That's as close as I can think that they would come to just charging with inconsistency. Of course, the charges have long been answered. They were not
Hmm.
But that's the allegation. I mean, that's all I read.
Well, I mean, that's basically what you end up with when you run out of arguments is ad hominem arguments. You have to destroy the person, the character. But I mean, I cannot think of, I mean, short of somebody like Paul being a woman hater, that kind of allegation, but that's really a product of, modern sensibilities, right? I mean, I don't think anybody,
He loved his mama.
well, sure. I think that those things change, and that's the problem, isn't it? That when you're observing something that happened, thousands of years ago, you're observing with a different mindset and a mindset that's so far removed, and it has all these foreign ideas. Certainly, you tend to be biased, right? Um, so I can see where people today, they might have modern sensibilities, but that doesn't make it right. That just makes it, current. But people have had all kinds of ideas across the centuries that turned out to be not so good. Owning other human beings, for instance, that didn't turn out so well. That was, I think we look askance at that. Murdering people because they're a certain ethnicity, not
I
a
guess
good.
on this point, the critics would train their guns on the authenticity of the books. They would say it bears the name Matthew, but that's anachronistic. It's after the fact. This was the nameless early Christian community, maybe sometime in the late first century or early second century, who gathered together their oral traditions and came up with a narrative, and then they attributed it to Matthew,
Mm-hmm.
but that he's not actually the author. So we don't know who the authors were or what the pedigree of the information is. But the question then that goes to a discipline we normally call higher criticism,
Mm-hmm.
which is not a bad thing. Higher criticism can be good, and it's the study of those very questions: the authorship, the dating of the books, and so on. And there's very powerful evidence that these are the actual authors. There's external evidence from a number of ancient writers who say that they were the authors, and then you have internal evidence that indicates that, such as in Luke's case in particular. Anyway, that's probably the tack they would take today.
I would say though, I mean personally, if someone brought that to me, I would counter with, I would still rather go with this, crowdsourced document, you know, a few years removed from the original, author than I would from a document that was generated, hundreds, thousands of years later by, let's say, the Catholic Church and their oral tradition. You always want to go back to the closest source. I mean, I suppose it is it arguable that there may have been an even earlier document that we are missing?
There's always the question of whether there was a separate doctrine known as Q, which I brought up a week or two ago,
Mm-hmm.
which supposedly was the source document of sayings that Matthew and Luke both apparently used. And they, in addition to Mark, they allege Mark was first, and they borrowed heavily from Mark. But then there was another source, and things that Mark doesn't bring up, a lot of Jesus' sayings, parables, and so on, that must have been contained in that other document we don't have any longer. Some argue that Q may have never been a document; it could have just been a body of oral tradition,
Mm-hmm.
if there ever were such a formal unit of teachings out that circulated at that time. But going back to the question of what they allege about the early church is they attribute nothing but political motives to the earliest Christians, that they would craft narratives in favor of their point of view long after the fact, and that there was no real basis in the historical facts from AD 33. That if you were talking about 80, 90, or later, that they could make allegations about things they said happened, but there's no way for many people who were gullible to check up on that to verify or falsify it.
Mm-hmm.
So they got away with it, and it was slowly evolving traditions that were later codified in these books, and they wrongly attributed the names to these authors. So if that were the nameless early church, it would be problematic for Christian evidences. But that's really grasping at straws, and that goes back to a lot of the higher criticism of the 18th century
Mm-hmm.
that still
You would still, though, I would argue that you're still talking about a document that speaks of self-sacrifice and denying of, the carnal lusts, and that's not something that human beings do. Human beings find wiggle room. They find ways to do the things. So you would see that in later in the Catholic tradition where they're, giving indulgences, for instance. You would expect that. That would be the argument you would think they would be making. Oh, see, there you go. There's the human influence, and those are definitely not. But they're not. They're not arguing against those documents. They're arguing against these, which are contrary to what the critics want to do in their personal lives, if that makes sense.
If you're telling a lie and you're caught in it, and it's going to cost you your life, and you admit it's a lie and can get out of it, most people will admit it's a lie and go on. But the apostles never did.
Mm-hmm.
They went to their death defending Christ and his church.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that there's plenty of evidence of that. Again, I think, and again, I'm not, I guess maybe I'm veering us off into territory that we weren't necessarily going to get into, but you can't gainsay the ability of these men. I mean, we have no reason to suspect that these men were, dishonest. They were writing things or they didn't have the ability, that they were writing things that they were just, just the fact that of their professions, not just anybody gets to become a doctor, not now and not back then. Tax collecting, I'm sure that was a skill, that was probably, you had to have some good survival tactics there. So these weren't men that didn't have the ability. So they had the bona fides, whatever. Anyway. So simply asserting the ancient unlearned men couldn't possibly observed and reported accurately is not an argument. It has to be backed by actual evidence of incompetence, which is not ever sufficiently supplied.
An example of that would be, I guess, if you caught them in a geographic error, some terrible historical blunder where they said such and such was king or governor at the time that we know he was not. That would be an example of incompetence. And you don't find that.
Yeah. Or maybe you find, there's some concurrent document back then that says, oh yeah, there was this guy, Luke, that was supposedly, involved in all this, and he purported to be a doctor, but he was just a con artist. And I mean, we don't have anything. And so you have to, at some point, you just have to take people's word for things. You have to, again, we're presuming innocent until proven guilty. I mean, that has served us very well. And again, if this got them anything, what did this gain anyone from lying or from misrepresenting? All that the Christians got was persecution this entire time, even to today. What good does it do you? Now, you could say that, back in the Middle Ages or, at some point in history, it did you good to become a member of the clergy because the church, when I use the word church, probably talking Catholic Church, was rich, had lots of riches. And so they were basically just amassing power. And so it probably did benefit you to go into that line of work. But apart from that kind of thing, it's not glamorous. I mean, it's not something that you're going to get rich off of unless you are a huckster, right? And those are usually easy to discern and easy to dispel. Anyway, but let me move on to number 3 here. So the number and consistency. 4 writers Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, writing independently at different times without collaborating on a single agreed script, yet substantially agreeing on the core events. Greenleaf's phrase for this pattern, borrowed from Paley, is substantial truth under circumstantial variety. Substantial truth under circumstantial variety. That combination, real agreement on the main facts, real disagreement on small incidental details, is exactly what honest, independent witnesses produce. Coached liars rehearse a matching story. Honest witnesses each remember it a little differently, or perhaps they just saw different things or saw them different ways. I guess you could argue that. Greenleaf even quotes a striking mathematical observation about what independent, unrehearsed agreement is worth as evidence. When several witnesses concur without any prior arrangement, that convergence itself carries weight beyond simply adding up each witness's individual credibility, because pure chance agreement among independent accounts is, in his words, as one to infinite against. He illustrates the point with two secular examples familiar to educated readers of his day. First, the well-known contradiction between the historians Lord Clarendon and Bishop Burnet over the execution of Lord Strafford. One records him condemned to hanging and executed the same day. The other records a beheading 2 days later. Second, and more strikingly, the 10 separate first-hand French royal accounts of the 1791 flight of the royal family from Paris to Varennes, I guess, which disagree with one another on numerous points, some trivial, some more significant. In neither case does any serious historian throw out the whole account over the discrepancies. We reconcile what we can and trust a substantial agreement, exactly as a jury is instructed to do with any set of witnesses. So people may remember different things, but they don't disagree on the big parts of the picture, the substantial things that happened. They might, incidental things they might remember differently, is this point. So again, the fact that there are, 4 different accounts and they all say substantially, and I would say the length of these documents and the number of things that they agree upon is significant as well. Would that be accurate to say? I mean, do we have anything that is similar? I guess I should have looked this up. I'll just kind of lean on Philip here. Is there any other kind of event that has this sort of corroboration from disparate, concurrent witnesses? Well, yeah. I mean,
Variety of stories told about, but in the main, the place where he was killed, and the time he died,
yeah,
how he died, that head wounds on.
Yeah. Who shot him? That may be up for grabs.
There are circumstantial varieties involved. There are nuts who question the official story.
Yeah. So, but we get the point though, and that is that, on the main points, they all agree, but there's just so much that they do agree on that is, but isn't it the differences and the little things here and there that make it even more trustworthy? I mean, the fact that you don't have the exact same boilerplate, same phrasing everywhere. I mean, that seems like that's evidence as well. It's kind of like if you have multiple camera angles of the same event, you would see the main focus of the event in frame, but one camera angle might have this side of the building. This camera angle might have this person in the view. So you get the same basic event, and you stitch all this together, and you come up with, let's put it in the terms of modern technology. There are these things now. They're called Gaussian splats. You familiar with? You ever heard that term, a Gaussian splat? So there's all kinds of technology now that you can take a camera and you can take multiple images, multiple different positions of a scene, and it stitches them together. Not just a well, not just a panorama, but literally a three-dimensional space that you can actually then walk around in. Where you can, it's interesting. So now they have this technology. It's called Gaussian splats, and you take all these individual pictures, and then in the background, computations are made to determine objects in the scene, and then all of these objects are represented with a multitude of points in a cloud, and they're different shapes and sizes and colors. And when you overlay them, it looks like a solid image, but it's just a point cloud. And then that allows you to rotate and to go into and look around in a scene. Now, it depends on how many angles you got as to how good these things are. But if we look at if you look at the Gospels like that, you see different multiple viewpoints, and we could take all of this together and stitch together a bigger picture than we could with just any one. So that's an interesting point to make. So, instead of trying to match up where they all converge and, disregarding the rest, you can get a better view of the entire, of that entire period of time by taking them all together and adding them together. And they don't significantly deviate. Okay. So that's number and consistency. Conformity with experience. This is where the miracle objection comes in. The philosopher David Hume argued that because miracles contradict the uniform experience of nature, no testimony could ever be strong enough to establish one. Greenleaf's answer: Hume's whole system rests on the unproven assumption that nature runs by fixed, unbreakable laws that even God himself could not have made and could not alter, an assumption that Greenleaf dismisses memorably as resting on nothing firmer than, quote, the tortoise on which stands the elephant, which upholds his system of atheism, unquote. I like that. It's turtles except for the elephant. It's turtles all the way down. If a creator exists who could set the ordinary course of nature in motion, there is no contradiction in that same creator occasionally departing from it for sufficient reason. More importantly, Greenleaf notes that the individual facts within each miracle are perfectly ordinary matters any witness could testify to. A man was blind for years. Jesus spoke to him. He sees now. Lazarus had been dead and buried 4 days. Jesus called him out of the tomb. He came out and was seen alive long afterward. Whether the connection between the two is miraculous is a separate question from whether the plain, observable facts happened. And those facts were tested precisely the way you'd test any other public, physically witnessed event. Here's another quote. A juror would violate his oath if he should refuse to acquit or condemn a person charged with an offense where this measure of proof was adduced. Greenleaf's point is that if a jury would be bound to accept plain, credible testimony to an ordinary fact, a man was blind and now sees, in any other case, refusing that same testimony here requires a separate, unproven philosophical assumption, not a genuine evidentiary objection. So you just have to call, you call balls and strikes as you see them. If you're a witness, you have to be an impartial observer, impartial witness. You can't put your own biases into it and be credible. All right, and then finally, test number 5. A false witness sticks to safe generalities because specific, checkable details are dangerous to fabricate. True witnesses, by contrast, casually mention background details without any need to, and without any awareness they're providing verification, that turn out to match everything else we know. Another quote, a false witness will not willingly detail any circumstances in which his testimony will be open to contradiction, nor multiply them where there is danger of his being detected. Every lawyer knows how lightly the evidence of a non me recordo, I don't know if I'm saying that right, a non me recordo witness is esteemed. A non me ricordo witness is Italian for I do not recall. It was a legal shorthand of the era for an evasive witness who conveniently forgets any detail that might be checked. Greenleaf compares this to how circumstantial evidence functions in ordinary criminal trials. A burglary case where a broken knife blade left at the scene is later found to fit perfectly into a knife recovered from the accused's pocket, or a murder case where torn paper wadding from a pistol matches a letter found on the suspect. In both cases, no one fact alone proves guilt, but the improbability of so many small details lining up by coincidence is overwhelming. Greenleaf runs through the trial of Jesus as an example of exactly this kind of unrehearsed checkable detail. That Pilate held the power of life and death is confirmed by Tacitus and Josephus. That condemned prisoners were customarily scourged before execution, mocked beforehand, and made to carry their own cross to the place of execution are all separately documented Roman practices. That the charge against Jesus was posted above the cross in 3 languages matches Josephus's report that public notices in Jerusalem were routinely trilingual. Even the detail that Jesus' body was released for burial to the request of friends matches the ordinary Roman custom for anyone not classed as an infamous criminal. None of these details were necessary to the gospel writer's story. They simply match, incidentally, everything else we independently know about Roman and Jewish practice in that period. Greenleaf makes one more observation worth lingering on. Across 4 independent authors, a single, consistent, deeply human portrait of Peter emerges, impulsive, bold, warm-hearted, and prone to failure, without any one writer ever sitting down to describe his character directly. It simply falls out of small incidental details scattered across all 4 accounts. Peter is first to answer, first to draw a sword in Jesus' defense, first to run to the empty tomb, bold enough to attempt walking on water, and fearful enough to sink, courageous enough to defend the apostles publicly at Pentecost, and weak enough to have denied his Lord 3 times only weeks before. Fiction writers construct character on purpose, with an eye to consistency. Greenleaf's point is that this kind of accidental, cross-corroborated consistency, 4 authors independently supplying pieces of the same unflattering mosaic, is a fingerprint of real memory, not invention. And he closes with the character of Jesus himself, a figure with, quote, no error, no sinister intention, no imprudence, no ignorance, no evil passion, no impatience. A portrait, Greenleaf argues, that no ancient or modern imagination had ever produced for any of its invented gods. The gods of the surrounding pagan world, he notes elsewhere in his introduction, were routinely violent, capricious, lustful, reflections of the very cultures that worshipped them. A perfectly consistent, perfectly holy character sustained across every recorded situation, from public triumph to agony of the cross, is not the kind of thing 4 separate ancient writers stumble into by accident, and not the kind of thing any of their contemporaries had ever managed to invent for a god of their own making. I think that's an interesting point.
We wonder how the human race has a sense of morality, whether it be innate, instilled by God in our inner man in some way, or transmitted, by generations of learning all the way back from the time of Noah, maybe. We don't know exactly how to explain. We just know it's a fact. We do all have some sense of right and wrong. And there are some people who, since they know it's good, they feel like they ought to try to do the good. And first time maybe these who are unevangelized hear the message about Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
and they see this character. That's a beautiful point. It's a wonderful point. They see this character, it clicks like with what they know about goodness. Well, that matches what I know about goodness. And if I want to try to be good, I want to be more like that character.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of a simplistic, yet I think it's an important sort of apologetic within itself. It's not that they necessarily used a lot of sophisticated reasoning to get there. It's just innate. You can preach to some people in cultures where they're not quite highly educated, maybe not very developed, and the gospel can go there the first time. And you get a lot of people who are interested and will follow the missionary around and listen. You wonder, how is it that happens? I mean, they haven't been given a lot of persuasive evidence, and yet they have. Just the very story, the telling of the story about this good man Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
it resonates somehow in those who want to do good. But then in these cultures, you have a lot of wicked people too, and they revel in their wickedness,
Mm-hmm.
so they're going to reject it, obviously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to this other point about the gods that they invented for themselves, we do that too these days. We as a society, we take, in fact, we take, what used to be, symbols of, goodness and doing the right thing. It springs to my mind what sometimes people take, these old comic book characters, like, Superman, like, truth, justice, and the American way. But we tear them down, and modern versions of Superman, they make him into this figure that, is, oh, should I do the right thing? Oh, I'm trying, they wrestle with good and evil. And that's a modern thing, because I can remember back, when, Christopher Reeve was Superman. I mean, there was never any doubt. He was a Boy Scout, period. And it's still, to this day, I mean, it's the best version of Superman is that version, because there is no deviation, that original one. Now, of course, you have the sequels where he's, they get a little off track. But again, it's always that good and pure version of him. And people do that now. They do that with God, and they try to make God out to be, this the thing that he is not, which is not purely holy, purely good. But it's just to sate their own conscience. It's just to make themselves feel less bad about who they are and the fact that they just will not choose to do good.
And you normally in human history don't find people that will sacrifice their life for a lie.
Mm-hmm.
And people have done it ever since the beginning of time.
Yeah.
They believe in God, and some people don't like them believing it, and they kill them, or they threaten to kill them, but they still stand up for what they believe. That's one of the greatest examples I can think of.
Mm-hmm.
Of authentic, authenticity of how you put it, the reality of the Christian Bible. And
Yeah, I mean, people hate. There's some people that just hate goodness, and they resent it, and they find an excuse to try and get rid of it. I mean, you see that every day. I mean, literally every day now. People hate the light. So, yeah, it is kind of an amazing thing, because you look back at, historically all these, Greek and Roman gods, and they're all drunkards, or they had whatever human problems reflected. God, Jehovah God, the true God, is the exception to that. Holy, demands holiness, demands purity, but is not vengeful at all. I mean, well, he's vengeful, but not against people that are doing. I mean, he's not capricious. Let me put it this way. Okay, not capricious in that, he rewards the good and punishes the bad, and does not just randomly decide, you know what, I don't like the look of that guy, let's just, kill him, whatever. This God, the one that these men wrote about, and Jesus, his son, are just unique, period.
Contrast that with what we know, even the story they themselves tell about Muhammad.
Yeah.
Their so-called prophet, great prophet. You couldn't say that accurately about him, that he had no error or sinister intention or imprudence or ignorance or evil passion or impatience.
Mm-hmm.
He had all of those things and more vices.
But that's why they like him. They see themselves and they say, this guy, I could, and this guy is God's chosen. So, or
I'm afraid you're right about that.
but people, they get into that. They enjoy that. So again, a character that no one would invent. So let's talk about finally the verdict. Again, another quote. The narratives of the evangelists are now submitted to the reader's perusal and examination. Upon the principles and by the rules already stated, his business is that of a lawyer examining the testimony of witnesses by the rules of his profession in order to ascertain whether, if they had thus testified on oath in a court of justice, they would be entitled to credit. Greenleaf's own conclusion, after applying every test a courtroom would apply to any witness, the evangelists would be believed, not because they demand blind faith, but because, tested by the same rules we use to settle property disputes, criminal trials, every other question of fact in human affairs, their testimony holds up. So it's worth being precise about what this verdict does and doesn't claim. Greenleaf never argues that the gospel's credibility proves Christianity is true in some deeper theological sense. He explicitly set that question aside at the start. What he claims is narrower and for that reason harder to dismiss. That the documentary and testimonial case for the Gospels is at least as strong as the case we accept without a second thought for any other ancient history we rely on. His challenge to the reader isn't to believe without evidence, it's be consistent with the standard of evidence you already use for everything else. So again, maybe it's not, we're not talking about some sort of airtight argument we can make that will convince someone of the validity that this is God's word. But what it is doing is it's not allowing them off the hook and to just dismiss it because, it's an ancient text and you really can't trust an ancient text. People made things up. They hallucinate. Like, come on. Again, you get into this chronological snobbery that I always like to talk about. Is it at least any less trustworthy than what you have pinned your beliefs on? Are you really telling me that this is less credible than the testimony of, some charlatan, some atheist, for instance? At least put it on the same footing and give it the same sort of hearing that you would any other document that is legitimate, that we can prove is not a forgery or fake, which we can easily do that. So anyway, like I said, this was just kind of a quick lesson, and hopefully it was a lot of this is rehashing, but I just think it's fascinating that most of the things that we have pulled these thoughts out of came after this document. So, I don't know if it's just coincidental or if, this document was read and then kind of unconsciously rehashed in arguments later on. But it is an interesting thing to see the persuasiveness of this argument and the tenacity of these types of arguments. And it's just common sense. We should, why would a person just reject out of hand an ancient document? Most of the time, people just gobble that stuff up. They say, ooh, we found this ancient document. What can the ancients and their wisdom tell us? except if it's the gospel and it's, I don't want any of that because I got personal vices that I like to indulge myself in. All right, so next week